headlines for today, the Obasanjo says efforts to address the war on Tigray show slow but steady progress forward. The AU and UN have criticized for failure to act to address the crisis within Ethiopia, and The Economist has said the government media censorship is becoming yet again a norm within Ethiopia. As we move on to our main updates for today, AU Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa says efforts to address the war on Tigray are showing slow but steady progress. Olusegun Obasanjo told BBC's Focus on Africa that the situation today is better than what it was 6 months ago.
And I believe that what we should be doing, and which we are doing, is to continue to increase confidence-building measures.
Let's break it down a bit, sir. What are the main issues you are discussing in your meeting? You're saying that you're not yet where you want to be.
Well, we want to be where there is unhindered and free movement of humanitarian supplies, and where there is nowhere in Ethiopia where there's need for humanitarian supplies and humanitarian supplies are not getting there. We want to get to a stage of negotiated ceasefire, which will make possible the formal declaration of cessation of hostility.
When asked what pressure he can bring to bear on the warring parties, the AU Special Envoy had this to say.
Mine is not to bring pressure. Mine is, in fact, to release pressure so that if they have pressure on either side, for me to remove their pressure so that they start seeing themselves in peace terms rather than in pressure terms and for war.
When Obasanjo opted out not to put a timeline for the belligerent parties to reach a ceasefire and a cessation of hostilities agreement. Let's take a listen.
What I believe is that we should continue to build on success. And they have something now they call humanitarian ceasefire. I believe we should move from humanitarian ceasefire to negotiated ceasefire. And this negotiated ceasefire should lead us to what I call formal declaration of cessation of hostility. And then we should, of course, by the time we get to that, we should have a restoration of services in all parts of Ethiopia, both the regions like Tigray, where no services of electricity, of water, of banking is on now, and in other parts where the war has affected some of their services. I went to a university where the ICT center had been completely destroyed. You need that facility to be brought back. I believe that this is what we are doing. Whether it will be done, I will get this in a month, in 3 months, in 6 months, in 1 year, I don't know. But I believe we may get it earlier than most people expect.
Olusegun Obasanjo has been shuttling for months now between Addis and Mekelle in an attempt to broker peace between the two sides. In related development, Foreign Affairs says AU Peace and Security Council and the UN Security Council have failed to act to address the crisis in Ethiopia. Foreign Affairs Journal published an article titled Ethiopia's Invisible Ethnic Cleansing, detailing the horrific abuses taking place in Western Tigray zone. Timnith Bairu has more on this update.
For more than a year and a half, a largely invisible campaign of ethnic cleansing has played out in Ethiopia's northern Tigray region. Older people, women, and children have been loaded into trucks and forced out of their villages and hometowns. Men have been herded into overcrowded detention sites where many have died of disease, starvation, or torture. In total, several 100,000 Tigrayans have been forcibly uprooted because of their ethnicity. Early in the conflict, Amhara security forces and officials gained control of Western Tigray, where with the Acquiescence of possible participation of Ethiopia's federal military, they have carried out a brutal campaign of ethnic cleansing against Tigrayan communities. Many of these abuses have been hidden from view. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's government has imposed communication restrictions throughout Tigray and obstructed the efforts of independent investigations, journalists, and humanitarian workers, making it difficult to verify accounts from the region. In the first half of 2021, chilling reports of rapes, killings, and mass displacement nonetheless trickled out, prompting U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken to condemn the ethnic cleansing and call on Ethiopian and Amhara troops to withdraw. Ethiopian authorities, however, have since sealed off Tigray almost entirely, severing telecommunications and even banking services. But as investigators for Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have shown, the atrocities have continued. For over 10 months after Blinken's condemnation of the ethnic cleansing, Amhara's regional officials and security forces carried out a systematic campaign of war crimes and crimes against humanity, including murder, unlawful imprisonment and torture, forced displacement, sexual violence, possible extermination, and other inhumane acts. The United States and other countries have pressed for a cessation of hostilities and sought to negotiate humanitarian access to Tigray, but they have largely ignored the horrors in the west of the region. According to Foreign Affairs, the world can no longer afford to look away. Foreign Affairs stressed that the African Union's Peace and Security Council and the UN Security Council must include Ethiopia on their formal agendas, press for immediate access to detention facilities in western Tigray, and insist on sustained and unimpeded access by humanitarian organizations. Foreign Affairs says as the veil lifts on the atrocities in western Tigray, the Ethiopian government and international bodies need to stop the abuses and put an end to impunity. It added, at stake is the survival of thousands of detained Tigrayans and hundreds of thousands more who either live in fear or have fled their homes and live under siege conditions.
Welcome back. You're still tuned into TMA's Daily English News, and thank you for that update, Timnit Bairu. As we move on to our next update, while ethnic cleansing still continues in the north, in Ethiopia, mass detentions have also signaled the shrinking of press freedom. 22 media employees have been arrested across Ethiopia this year alone, and Timnit Bairu presents the story again based on a report done by Al Jazeera.
During the course of this month, Ethiopian police pounced on local newsrooms, detaining 19 people, including journalists, magazine editors, and talk show hosts. The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission called on for the release of all detained media personnel. In addition, The Economist correspondent Tom Gardner was expelled from the country on May 13th. At least a dozen of the arrests are linked to critical coverage of the breakout of fighting between the Ethiopian military and militias in the Amhara region. In addition, security forces in the region have detained more than 4,000 anti-government demonstrators and opposition politicians critical of plans to demobilize ethnic Amhara militias. The arrests raised the total number of media employees arrested across Ethiopia this year to 22. The Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, says it has documented a drastic decline in press freedom in Ethiopia over the last 3 years, a decline that has accelerated during the ongoing civil war. It begs belief that a mere 3 years ago, during World Press Freedom Day in Addis Ababa, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed boasted to the world that there was not a single Ethiopian journalist behind bars. Angela Quintal, head of CPJ's African program, said, "Here we are in May 2022. Ethiopia is back to its mass arrests and arbitrary detention of journalists. To prevent the flow of information from the conflict zone to global audiences, Ethiopia severed communications to the Tigray region and barred journalists and aid workers from traveling there. In January 2021, in the middle of the media blackout, Tigray-based reporter Dawit Kabede Araya was shot dead by Ethiopian troops, becoming the local press community's first death since 1998. Despite the blackout, journalists managed to unearth the horrors of the war, including government atrocities against civilians. By the end of 2021, Ethiopia had detained at least 46 members of its own local press, including the likes of Bikila Amenu and Dasudullah, newscasters of the Oromia News Network, who stand accused of conspiring against the state. If convicted of crime, they could end up with death sentences, according to Ethiopia's penal code.
Thank you, Timnit. The Abala, an Ethiopian border town, is left in ruins amidst a shaky humanitarian truce. Last week, the New Humanitarian became the first international media outlet to visit Abala since the Tigray forces withdrew from the town and other territories within the Afar region in late April. Timnit Bayer presents this report by the New Humanitarian.
There's almost no one left in Abala, a once bustling town on the border of Ethiopia's Tigray and Afar regions. Its streets are empty, given over to stray dogs and troops of baboons that scavenge undisturbed among the abandoned houses. Since March, a fragile humanitarian truce has been in place between the federal government and the government of Tigray. The Tigray army entered Afar in late December, taking control of several districts, including Abala, in what they described as an attempt to secure an aid corridor to Tigray, where 5.2 million people need humanitarian assistance, including 450,000 malnourished children. In Abala, Tigrayan residents were massacred by local Afar security forces and militia. Nearly all the homes and shops in Abala, which had a pre-war population of several thousand, have been gutted by looting, their doors hanging open. Tigrayan residents who spoke to the New Humanitarian said that several Tigrayans were murdered in the town for resisting the looting of their properties by local Afar before the Tigray army took control. Several residents, both Afar and Tigrayan, described how Afar militia, police, and security forces gathered the town's Tigrayan population at various sites within the town as the Tigray army approached, and as the sound of fighting rang out from the surrounding mountains. The Tigrayans were then transported to a detention center in Samara, Afar's capital, according to two Abala residents and a UN official and a lawyer who said the site is guarded by regional Afar soldiers. Some 9,500 Tigrayans from Abala are currently being held there. The militia said, "We are taking you to the police station for your own safety, to save you from death." One Tigrayan from Abala told the New Humanitarian over the phone from the detention center in Samara. "After that, they told us to get into lorries. This is an order," they said. "We never realized we were coming to Samara. We were then taken forcefully." He added that one person was killed for refusing to board the trucks, and that around 50 youths jumped from the vehicles on the way to Samara, resulting in one death. He believes they then fled to Tigray. The detained Tigrayan described how local Afar, armed with guns, had looted the property of Tigrayan residents over the course of the days, starting from December 19th as the fighting around the town intensified. "I saw the looters. They were Afar. We knew them," he said. "They came from the rural areas and the town. They just collected the property in the street and carried it away in cars." He added that he saw the bodies of 3 of his Tigrayan neighbors lying on the street. "They had bullets in their heads," he said. "I didn't know which person killed them specifically, but it was the Afar militia." "After we arrived at the police station, my friends told me they saw more than 100 bodies in the road. Another was killed by a mortar or heavy machine gun." The looting accounts were echoed by a second Tigrayan from Abala who was being held at the same detention site in Samara. "Every shop and all the houses were looted," he said. "Everyone was carrying a gun to loot. We were left only with the clothes on our backs." The 2 Tigrayan residents from Abala described bleak conditions at the detention site in Samara, where temperatures regularly soar past 40 degrees Celsius. Aid agencies have delivered food, but one of the men said there was no medication available except paracetamol. Both said around 70 people had died in the detention center, and that it is only possible to leave by paying hefty bribes to the Afar soldiers guarding them.
Thank you, Timnit, on the update on Abala compiled by the New Humanitarian. As we move on to our final update, The Economist says government media censorship is becoming again the norm in Ethiopia. The Economist reported that Abiy Ahmed's government's crackdown on local and international press has come from one of The Economist's journalists by the name of Tom Gardner. Talking to The Economist podcast, quote unquote, The Intelligence, Tom Gardner detailed the circumstances that led to his expulsion from the country. Let's take a listen.
Well, I have to say it's all a little bit murky in my mind, but the proximate cause appears to have been questions I posed privately about the work of a Western academic who conducted some research into the war, which whitewashed the government's part in it. This sort of triggered at the start of May a strangely vicious online campaign against me, which was pretty swiftly picked up by state media.
Gardner added that the harassment of journalists has in fact become a norm in Ethiopia. Let's take a listen.
Well, I think the very online nature of my treatment was a little bit distinct, but in terms of harassment of journalists, this is sadly the norm. Ethiopia's once quite promising new government has been drifting back into authoritarianism amid the ruins of this civil war, and many Ethiopian journalists, as well as activists, have been arrested just in the short time since I left the country a few weeks ago. Around the time of my expulsion, one person had just been violently abducted by armed men from his home. Since then, others have been spirited away to unknown places. In the past, some have been handed out of the country. 19 have been detained, mostly without charge, over the last few weeks. And then I should add, there have been other foreign journalists beside myself since the civil war began who've been either banished or barred from the country. In fact, the country's own human rights commissioner has recently called the latest round of arrests a new low in a country with a pretty dark history of ill-treating journalists already.
In related news, Kenya's Interior Minister mentioned Ethiopia's crackdown on journalists as standing in sharp contrast to Kenya's record in upholding press freedom. Let's take a listen.
Amount of freedom that we have. Nairobi, for your record, Bishop, Nairobi houses the largest number of foreign correspondents and media houses on this continent. I've challenged people, if you don't think there's freedom in Nairobi, go and report from Addis. Yeah. With all this freedom we have, in a country where the president is insulted liberally by everybody, by opposition politicians.
Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has been blamed for his role in the stoking of this 18-month Tigrayan war and for silencing and attempting to silence his critics and succeeding as well. That concludes our news for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.